everyone, and welcome to the latest of Eastern Eye's virtual roundtables. Today, where does power lie in the UK? And when will Black, Asian and minority ethnic people get a share of it, please? If we agree that real power in the UK lies in government, and this is the most diverse cabinet in the history of this country, then we have nothing to worry about, right? Except that isn't the whole story, is it? No. Power resides in the civil service, the judiciary, the armed forces, the police, footsie companies, health trusts, the media and arts, and with the wonderful intervention of Marcus Rashford, sport as well. The statistics, if you can find them, are stark. If truth be told, they're opaque and spun, and not quite what they often seem. Unless you ask questions, unless the authorities engage, the figures compare apples and pears, and you end up totally confused. But let's try to unravel what's going on. The most senior civil servant is a permanent secretary. As of March 2019, of the 40, there are no Black, Asian or minority ethnics that we know about. Of the 40 plus chief constables in England and Wales, none is BAME. 7% of court judges are Black or Asian, but there are no heads of division. In October 2018, the MOD revealed that of the 9 bands, bands 7, 8 and 9, the generals, if you will, none is an ethnic minority. You're getting the pattern. FTSE 100 companies are unlikely to reach the target that all will have at least one minority board member by the end of 2021. That's next year, as recommended in the Parker Review of 2017. So they've had 4 years. The health trusts are doing better. In 2019, 8 of the 227 chief executives were Black or Asian. And finally, let's turn to sport. Football. 6 of the 92 head coaches or managers in the English Football League are BAME. When it comes to South Asians, well, we can claim 3 players. This season, Hamza Chowdhury made 25 appearances for Leicester City, Neil Taylor, 14 outings for Aston Villa, and Danny Batth, 37 for Stoke City in League One. Joining me today to discuss all this are Dawn Butler, Labour MP for Brent Central and former Shadow Women's and Equality Secretary, Lord Simon Woolley, a crossbencher peer, founder and director of Operation Black Vote and chair of the government's Race Disparity Unit. Sundar Katwala is the director of the Identity and Integration think tank British Future and the former general secretary of the Fabian Society. Sanjay Bandari is the chair of football's Kick It Out, but before that, he was in senior leadership roles at global consultants KPMG and EY. For transparency purposes, I was a member of Leicester City's Kick It Out committee many moons ago. Panel, welcome. Let's go to the first of our issues, which is where the levers of power actually resides. And I want to start off with something that's been prevalent on most people's minds, and want to ask a question, first of all, to Dawn Butler, if I may. Ms. Butler, Black Lives Matter. Is that a slogan, or does government take it seriously?
It's more than a slogan, but obviously it's also an easy excuse for people to proclaim that they're doing something and yet doing nothing. It's more than a slogan, it's more than a hashtag. It's actually a combination of movements that have come together over many decades and centuries. And I think what makes Black Lives Matters now different and more important is that it's not just Black people who are out on the streets campaigning for change. There's many people that are out there marching, you know, white people, Asian people. There's many people that are out there marching for change. And how we get that change now is to not have these incremental small steps that happen every decade or so, is to make sure that we go to the structure and start dismantling the structural racism that exists in all of the organisations that you spoke of earlier. So the civil service, the government, the police, the judicial system. We have to start dismantling all of those structural racial inequalities that exist, and then we won't need to be here again. But it is absolutely more than just a slogan.
Sundar Katwala, your thoughts in terms of why is it different this time? What is it that's different from the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, and throughout?
Well, I think it is a powerful slogan and a powerful message, and an important message. And I think it's a message that means different things to different people. For some people, it's an urgent chance to speed up progress on race inequality in general. To a lot of people, it's a chance to shine the spotlight on the specific experiences of Black British people, and why that's different sometimes from other minority groups. It is, I think, about an impatience of a rising generation with this story of incremental progress. I mean, to some extent, the story of incremental progress makes quite a lot of sense to me, because my experience is that in some ways we sped up quite a lot in my lifetime. But we have a debate, I think, that often focuses on three spheres: Parliament itself, football, and the NHS. And they're probably the three spheres of British public life that have actually got a reasonably strong story to tell. Not nearly as strong in the boardroom, obviously, or in managers as on the pitch, but Parliament has actually accelerated a lot in the last 10 years. You don't see that in the political lobby that's covering journalism. You don't actually see that in the SPADs, in backroom politics. The NHS, as your reporting has shown, is much too white at the top, but it's a symbol of identity, integration, contribution in British society. It's our strongest national institution, and that's a really powerful thing, but that doesn't go all the way to the top. So what I think the impatience here is about, it isn't about, is it better than 20 years ago? It's, have we got to equal opportunity yet? And clearly there are disparities, but this isn't, I think, just a moment about what the disparities are. This is a moment about the fact that Black people, Asian people, ethnic minority people generally have got more presence, more profile, more power and more voice in public life than ever before. If you had the riots in 1981, there weren't any ethnic minority members of parliament. So I think that you've got to this point where the political class itself is much closer to looking like Britain, that young people who've done very well in education and done everything they're expected to want to see that experienced in the workplace. They're joining corporations that think of themselves as very liberal and as very open and are very inclusive, but are just not diverse at all at the top. So there are lots of traditional issues of ethnic exclusion at the bottom, but I think there is a demand to see progress get right to the top very quickly, not waiting, because it always takes time. And this is a moment, therefore, to speed up change.
Lord Simon Woolley, you've been in the game for quite some time. You founded Operation Black Vote. Is it impatience? Is that what is fueling this dramatic change right now in the 21st century?
Well, I think there's definitely impatience, and rightly so. But where we are at the moment is best characterized as having a perfect storm. On one side of that storm, you've had COVID-19 and the devastating impact that it's had on Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities in a heartbreaking sense. 90% of the doctors have been non-white, 30% of care workers, 25% of those care workers Filipinos. And what this disease has done in many ways is that I heard one minister say the disease is racist, and I've never heard such nonsense. It's not racist, but it has this amazing ability to target those areas in our society that are deeply racialized. And what do I mean by racialized areas of our society? Well, I mean low pay, 0-hour contracts, poor housing, inequality in health. And the disease has not only shone a light on it, but amplified it, laid it brutally bare. One element of the storm. The other element of the storm has been the death of George Floyd. And that element has convulsed, like the COVID-19 pandemic, has convulsed nations to go onto the street and say this: it's not just the knee that killed George Floyd, it's the American system. And the death is the extreme element of white supremacy. But there are other elements of white supremacy in housing, in health, in education. And young people, as Sunda said, Black and white, have gone to the streets not asking for change, but demanding it. And here's the difference, I would argue. Dawn might correct me if I'm wrong, but in our lifetime, Dawn, have we ever noticed so many white people looking at the death of George Floyd and other areas, and genuinely saying that couldn't happen to us. And so we're at a starting point in which, to many, not all, and not all key people, we're not having to start with, do you believe what we say? And then if you do, we can do stuff. We're at a historic moment in which people are saying, I can see it, I know it's wrong, what can we do to change it? That's historic. But my biggest worry is people will get weary very quickly and say, can we move on?
That is a concern, isn't it, Sanjay Bandari? One of your massive things that your profession is doing is taking the knee, showing that Black Lives Matter, and therefore keeping it in the public consciousness. So sport is a venue for good in that respect, but will it continue? Because the season is ending, we're going to have a hiatus. What happens after that? How do we keep the momentum going?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the return of football coincided with Black Lives Matter movement, and the players taking a knee, which I welcome, but and many of the clubs all saying the right things, as many businesses are. You see that all across all the social platforms, whether it's LinkedIn or Twitter or Insta or whatever. You'll see the black screens, and it'll be corporates as well as individuals doing all of that stuff. But we have to move beyond the gestures of solidarity and into concerted action. And what I am seeing is an appetite for that. I sort of published a manifesto a couple of weeks ago of this is what I think we need to see in football, some change that we need to see in football, and actually specific things that I want to see done. And we're having conversations with the FA. Paul Elliott did his open letter to football and talking about equality in football leadership. I think I want to talk a little bit about the sort of false dawn, because that's, sorry to use Dawn's name, sorry, but we were talking a little bit before we came on air about Liverpool fans and Liverpool. And actually, if you want to know about false dawns, ask Liverpool fans. Right, for the last 30 years, they've lived through false dawn and false hope. And so, there's a challenge for us. Is this an era? Is this a moment of? Is this another false dawn? Is this another period of false hope? I don't think it is, and I actually
what makes
think,
you say that?
Well, because of the number of white people that are also getting involved in this. And on Monday night here we had the incident with Burnley. The football club issued a statement at half-time. I know the chief executive. I was on the email to the chief executive on Monday night and talked to him on Tuesday morning. And Ben Mee, the captain of Burnley, straight after the game, he's asked about the game and says, I don't want to talk about the game. First of all, I want to talk about what happened with the banner. And then actually, if you notice, he never talked about the game. He never talked about the game at all. All he talked about was the banner. And Sean Dyche did the same thing. So all of Neil Hart, who's the chief executive, Sean Dyche, who's the manager, and Ben Mee, who's the captain, who's the leader in the dressing room, all said exactly the same thing. And we're all bang on point. That to me is different, and that's our hope for the future. There's something about the catalyst for this I just wanted to just briefly observe on, which is why is it different this time, and what has been different? And to me, it's a combination of COVID, and the lockdown has meant we are all highly sensitized to news because we've been sat indoors for 13 weeks with all our attention on our screens. So anything that comes across our screens, we view. And there is something about the specific death and the killing of George Floyd that is our Tiananmen Square moment. It's the equivalent of that image of the protester at Tiananmen Square with the tank. And the reason is, there was a similar death 2 years ago with Eric Garner, and they were similarly videoed. But what is different here is the prolonged nature of it. It's 8 or 9 minutes. It's face onto the camera. It's the fact that one of the people behind the camera, you can see makes a move to try to intervene, and very casually one of the policemen makes a move for their gun or their taser. So if you're that cameraman, you can do nothing to intervene in this situation. And it's the look on Chauvin's face when he has his knee on George Floyd's neck, the hand in the pocket, the casual brutality, the looking directly in the camera, that's a provocative act. And what he's saying is, I'm doing this because I can, and you can do nothing about it. And there'll be no consequences, because there never are consequences for people like me when I do this. And I think we are all in the position of that cameraman, or the camera lady. I can't remember. I think it was a lady, actually. We're all in the position of that person, that powerlessness and that helplessness. And so Black Lives Matter has become a motif for all of us to think about, when have I been in that position? When have I felt powerless? When have I been unable to impact things that are going on around me, into that injustice that's going on around me? And I think there is something really, really powerful about that specific death and the way in which it's recorded that's created this movement.
Dawn Butler, we witnessed a public lynching with the death of George Floyd. But the point that Lord Woolley made was that this time it's different because white people are marching and are at the forefront of this as well. Do you buy into that?
Yeah, I think picking up on both what everybody has said, our lives, all of our lives were interrupted in those 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Because no matter what way you looked at the footage of the killing and the lynching of George Floyd, it couldn't be explained away. So for too often, people try and explain away racism. Oh, but he was being violent. Oh, but he had a gun. Oh, but, and some of it is so opaque that you think, oh, well, maybe they've got a point. There was nothing that could be explained away because it was so public. And then there was the other footage that came out the other direction that showed there were 3 other police officers all kneeling on George Floyd, all contributing to his death. So that is why it interrupted all of our lives in that moment where we're all on lockdown, and so we're all focused. So that interruption has led to this outpouring of change. And I agree, the contribution, the solidarity of everybody, of white people who are questioning their own privilege is so important, because it means that we no longer have to explain ourselves. So we've already got off the starting point because we've all seen it. So it's like, okay, what are we going to do now? And that is vital, because if it's just amongst us, they say, well, it's up to you to do it. It's up to you to do it. They've ticked that box. They've spoken about it. But now the only way that we can see the sustainable change is for everybody to take the lead in their own positions, in their own workplace, in their own area of responsibility, and call it out. And that is the only way that we will start to see that change. And I think the other reason why it's so different is because we have 3 generations who've had the fight. So my parents had the fight when they came over from the Caribbean, and they taught me resilience. You know, my parents taught me resilience. They didn't encourage me to go out and fight, even though I did a lot of fighting. But that wasn't their purpose. Their purpose was to teach me resilience so that I can get through it. And I understand that now. Do you know what I mean? I understand, you know, the sticks and stones will break your bones, but names will never hurt you. I understand what they were teaching me now. I understand it. My brothers taught me resistance. Do you know what I mean? They gave me the tools how to avoid getting arrested by the police, how to avoid getting beaten up. They taught me that resistance. So that was their job. They taught me the resistance. You know, and I came with all of that, fighting and doing my bit and all of that. And I think the next generation has all of that combined. Plus they have the strength of social media. They have the solidarity of everybody else that doesn't look like them, or now that's in them, because we are so much of a molded society now. So, you know, you can't just it's not so easy to separate people by the color of their skin. And so I think that is why now is such a different time, and it can't be so easily forgotten.
Senator Caswalla, I started this roundtable by trying to identify the levers of power. You're far brighter than I am. Tell me about where you see power lying.
Well, Simon's been right on the inside of trying to make this happen, and it's obviously it takes a lot of sustained work to take a moment that breaks through and then to turn that into institutional change. You've got to build the track and stay on it. And so how you sustain these movements is, I think, very challenging. I think the George Floyd moment in America and across the world is very similar to the Stephen Lawrence moment, just in terms of that thing we've been saying, that people see the world through new eyes and something they've been hearing about, they understand it. And so Guardian England and race activists and left-wing lawyers and the Daily Mail all looked at that case similarly, and Daily Mail England was saying, this shouldn't be like this. So I think it's quite similar. And, the police went on a process of change that made some important changes and didn't make enough changes and so on. And, other institutions, say the Home Office, generally never had that process and now has a choice about, with Windrush and accepting those reviews, does it do for the very first time embark on a process about what it's been hearing. So I think working out how to take this wish to tweet the hashtag and to say we're on side. What's interesting to me about institutions is when they do that, they are talking about how much distance they have from black people, because they are saying we are of course committed, but we know we don't understand, we know we need to listen. You can hear very much institutions saying we don't know very many of you really, and we should do better, but we don't know where to start. And so that's a big clue as to what the challenge is. I think we could be a little bit over optimistic here about the level of public take-up of this. I think it's very, very strong when people think about George Floyd in America and what they saw, and then bringing that over here, it's got some questions to answer as well, because people say, well, our police aren't quite like that. We haven't got that level of violence in our society. So what is the agenda here? And I think a lot of people are very confused about the fact that it's turned into a debate about statutes. Now, I'm sure people campaigning for racial inequality to be reduced don't want a debate about statues, and yet out in the least diverse bits of Britain, reading the newspapers, watching the BBC, there's a sense that it's turned into that, and what's that about, and we don't understand what's going on. And so people who are sympathetic to anti-racism in principle are saying our group's going to be more divided. So I think we've got to be conscious that we've got a big opportunity of institutional change, but we actually need to keep strengthening the storytelling of what the causes are, what the consequences are, and what the responses are. There was one survey that just asked people, do you support Black Lives Matter UK? And basically 50% of people say yes, and 25% of people say no, and 25% of people say don't know. But what you've really got is you've got a quarter that's very committed, half of the Labour vote, half of ethnic minorities saying this is an urgent chance. A lot of other people saying, well, I recognise that, but I need to hear more about it, but I like it, but what's it actually about? The anti-group we recognise, we know who they are, and they are shrinking over time, and we've got to push that back. But this large, I'm against racism, but I don't know if this is bringing people together or is dividing people more. I think that isn't people flying a White Lives banner plane, being very provocative. It's people who genuinely don't quite know what's going on. If you're under 30, if you're under 40, you've got enough lived experience here to feel that you understand what that's about. So I think we've got to push very fast for change in institutions, but actually be careful about the storytelling we tell about why is tackling inequality and race inequality good for everybody in society, so we don't get into this them and us debate about if those issues are addressed, my issues won't be.
Simon Woolley, just want to expand on that. We had the Starman inquiry, we've had inquiry after inquiry on race, the Macpherson inquiry, and we're 3 generations into this country, and yet we're nowhere further forward as much as we should be. Why is that?
Well, it's interesting that Sandy should talk about the levers of change, but also have some cynicism to suggest whether or not it will be long lasting. And the reality is that the biggest change we had was after the Stephen Lawrence inquiry and the Race Relations Amendment Act. And what you had there, you had a groundswell of demand from campaigners, but you also had a government that wanted to do the right thing. And actually, when you think about it, that legislative change that they brought in, looking back now, was incredibly bold. Well, every public institution in the country have a duty to promote race equality, etc., etc. And yet, for many, jerk chicken on Black History Month, and that's about as far as it got. Now, fast forward now, Barney, to this moment, and it's the opposite. We have a government that is not embracing this challenge, and too often has to be dragged kicking and screaming, whether it's Windrush or COVID-19. And so it's going to be very difficult for us to use the internal levers of power for change But on the outside, you have a great appetite from academic institutions, from business institutions, and from society in general to have this conversation. For me, the jury's out on whether or not this will be superficial or whether it will be big change. But it won't be driven from the center, because the center are resisting. The center are saying, can we please change the narrative? And we as activists are saying, it's not the narrative that needs changing, it's the systems.
And what does your gut instinct say, Simon?
My gut instinct says, that's interesting you should ask this, and this is really important. Whilst instinctively, I don't think they get it, I'm hoping that they will bow to outside pressure to change. Of course, you get greater change when you have willing participants. But I think even if we ignore the center of government, I'm still convinced that we can make monstrous inroads in our other institutions, with our academic institutions, with our sporting institutions, Sanjay, because they're already halfway down the track. My view is concentrate on people that you can work with and drive a coaching horses through that. And by doing that, we will drag government along with us because they will have no other choice.
Sanjay Bandari, I mean, let's be quite honest about this. When sports people talk, when they take the knee, they influence. But there's something that's really preying in the back of my mind. We talk about structural racism. Let's take out the word structural. This racism is deep-seated. It's ingrained in our history. What can we do to change that?
You know, I think what Simon and Sandra have just been talking about actually is quite interesting. I think what they've described is really a microcosm from a government perspective of actually what plays out in every industry. You know, I came from a more from the sort of service as really responding by paying lip service, and some will really see this as an opportunity to change, and we'll see that across multiple industries. And in football, yeah, football's a bit of a lightning rod for society. It's that old chicken and egg thing about people blaming, maybe people outside of football blaming football for the ills of society, and football responding with, well, it's not a football problem, it's a societal problem. Well, guess what? It's kind of both. Racism is kind of both. I think football has always been a lightning rod, and it will play out those extremes because it is so tribal. And actually, part of the problem with the rest of society is that the rest of society has actually become like football and become too much like football. We are far too tribal as a society now, so that actually we can't engage with each other's ideas. What we have to do is nobble the opponent, and we play the person rather than the ball far too often in public debate. So my sense in football is there really is an appetite for change, and I think everyone I speak to, they want to do the right thing. The challenge is, how do you do it, and how do you get things done? So what are the initiatives? But there's also a much bigger challenge, which is, and this is, I suppose, across sport more generally, I think there are kind of, you have to go to pincer movement, and I think there's probably a prize in different industries. We have to have grassroots movements like taking a knee that create pressure, but you've got to be clear on what it is you're asking for. And then we have to actually talk to the people who've got the levers of power to deliver those things that people are asking for. Now, the misunderstanding in sport is that the levers of power are the FA and the Premier League, as if the Premier League itself is its own entity. It's not. It's not. The Premier League, like the EFL, is a club. It's like your golf club committee. They have to, and all the members, the member clubs are the members, and they have to vote for things. So actually, what you've got to do is influence the clubs and get the clubs to do things, because the FA cannot control your license to operate in the same way that the Bank of England or the Financial Conduct Authority or Ofcom can control the license to operate for those who operate in that industry. They don't operate in that way. They don't have those powers. So where's the real power in football? It's with the commercial sponsors. That's where you have to go and have your conversations. It's with Sky and BT Sports and Nike and Adidas. It's the people who put the money into football and have that geyser of cash keep flowing, because that is the bit that football responds to. And I think in any industry, my advice would be think about those pincer movements. What do you want those grassroots people to create the movements and the demands for, and be really clear on your 2 or 3 demands? I've been working with a youth group this week saying, let's be really clear what you're asking for. And I think some of that should be accountability, reporting your statistics, really, making more of a data-driven approach. But then at the top is really understanding really genuinely who has the power and having the conversations with those people. And that will vary from industry to industry and from business to business.
But we've seen, have we not? We've been waiting 3 generations for change. And then Here comes a 23-year-old football player who says, I'm going to change the way that we do free school meals. It can be done in an instant, just like that, if we really want it.
Well that kind of thing can, because it's a point issue and a point solution. Part of the challenge with systemic racism is, can you identify what the problem is? So I had a debate with John Barnes last week who told me that the pitch was a pure meritocracy. And I said, really? Because I'm a member of the biggest ethnic minority of the country. I don't see anyone like me. 42 years since Viv Anderson made his debut for England. Where's the Asian player? And I've got people at, top 6 academy saying to an Asian parent, why should I invest in your kid? Because they're going to become a lawyer and accountant because that's what you want. Right. So we've got to look at what are the big systemic biases. And I go back to, I come from a legal background. We had there's a legal concept called res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself. They just focus on the things that speak for themselves. Those are the huge, egregious statistical anomalies. Boardrooms that are white and male. The coaching fraternity largely comes from the playing fraternity. 30% black players, 5% at the best estimate black coaches. Something's going wrong in the system. Largest ethnic minority in the country, Asian people, no players. So there are things that are going wrong there. We need to tackle those and work out what are those, the concrete steps that we do to tackle those. That isn't an overnight thing. That's not Marcus Rashford can launch a campaign and suddenly the government or the FA will launch something and it's solved overnight by giving 100 million. That is sustained change over periods of time.
Dawn Butler, why are we still 3 generations on, mired in lack of progress?
It is because it's structural. Until we dismantle the structural barriers, we will only ever have small incremental progress. That is a fact. So we have to take away the barriers. Like I say, you have 2 people going for a job, on the outside, they'll say, well, you've both got to run 100 meters, right? But the problem is for the black or brown person in our lane, we've got hurdles. And so on the outside, it seems it's quite fair. It's 100 meters, but no one's talking about the hurdles that are there in between in that race. And so that's why you have to dismantle and take away all of those hurdles to make it fair. So it's 100 meters on a flat plane. Otherwise, it's not fair. And how we get change is by teaching history properly. Because this systemic racism spans right from the very moment you go to school, where history is taught in a way that's to make one group of people feel inferior and another group of people feel superior. And it happens right throughout the schooling. And so the history needs to be a complete overhaul. It needs to be decolonized, and history needs to be taught properly in its entirety. If we just take COVID, for instance, and, Simon was right. There was ministers saying, the virus is racist. No, the virus isn't racist. Society is racist. I mean, if you look at the doctors who were dying at the beginning of COVID, right, as we know, out of the first 17, 16 of them were black and Asian. But yet still, if you look on TV, the only doctors we were seeing talking about it were white doctors. So how does that work? How comes the doctors dying are of color, but actually the only doctors we hear about on the TV are white? So why is that? Why is that association only associated, with white doctors? Why is black history only about slavery? I mean, the most fights at school was when, black history was taught, or when, Roots was on, you know, and you go to school and people all of a sudden became brave. You know, it's in school that we have to change all of that. And we have to start not only changing the narrative, but changing the way things look, just the reality of it. It's not like we're not asking for more, we're asking for fairness. But actually, I want more than fairness now, and I want more than equality, I want equity. You know, that's what I want now, and that's how I think we will see real change.
Simon, Woolley, you said that government will be forced to change.
Yeah.
So here's an idea. Why doesn't it just do the right thing rather than succumb to public pressure?
Government, let me just help Simon. Governments, Simon's right, governments will work, the government that we currently have will work with the power of the people, forcing them to work. I mean, Marcus changing the government's mind isn't because he was just, you know, one person on Twitter, it's because he had a massive following. But anyway, back to you, Simon.
Yeah, no, I mean, Dawn's right, unfortunately. I mean, when I worked with Theresa May, and I know a lot of people didn't get what she was trying to do. And I think not least because it also twin tracked with an immigration policy that was wrong, frankly. But the immigration policy aside, when I put to her that we should have a race audit of the Home Office, and she said, that's a good idea. And then when she came into power, she said, let's not do it just for the Home Office, let's do it right across the piece. Her starting point was, we need to lay bare the uncomfortable truths. And when we know what we've got to deal with, we can have an action plan. The mantra we devised, I think it actually came from David Lammy-Dawn, but it was explain these gross inequalities, explain them or change. And I was led as a cheerleader, if you want, and a champion to speak with ministers to change them. And it was a great moment in which the starting point is, how do we solve it? At the present time, with this present government, they're often saying, we don't believe you. Stop exaggerating. Stop talking about race inequality because you're causing more division. Now, if you can't even acknowledge there's a problem, it's very difficult to do anything about it. But as an activist, I guess I'm speaking to Couplish and our business fraternity, that you will know, being an entrepreneur, that you have to find a way around that. If you can't deal with that, well, you deal with another way around, and we have to do that. I think that the football players, for example, should be coming together collectively and saying, in the Premiership, we are at least 1/3 of the entertainers. In many teams, at least half. And collectively, they should be saying to the board members and the shareholders, after our football careers, we want a pathway to training and management. And we're not asking for it, we are demanding it. And if we don't get it, and if we don't get respected, we are taking our skills and our capital elsewhere. And we have to do that in there. We have to do it with the academic institutions, that the lack of black professors, the Eurocentric curriculum, and start making these demands, which we now have. And it's realizing, one, where power lies, and the levers that change it, and what our power we have right within our grasp. And often, Barney, that we refer to others, oh, politicians have got all the power, businessmen have got all the power, and not, actually, we have an immense amount, but we've got to understand it.
Okay, so let's solve the world's problems between us. Let's go on to the concrete changes that we need to make. Sundar Kaswala, what do we need to do?
Well, I thought Simon was right there, that explain or change narrative was important. You have the discomfort that things need to change, and then you have the focus on how do we look for solutions. And I'm a bit skeptical of some of the narratives, some of the macro narratives we might bring to this. A narrative that comes from sort of the left that says nothing ever changes on race over 3 generations. We've had 50 years of organised race advocacy in this country, and it achieved quite a lot. And it hasn't achieved enough, but it's achieved quite a lot, and we should be careful of writing it off. The first generation very much have the expectation that their children have better opportunities than they had, but that generation, the British born generation, feel there are still the hurdles in the way that Dawn speaks about, so progress isn't enough. So we should talk about learning from the change to build on it. If we talk about macro structural global issues about racism over time and over centuries, we're losing the fact our society's changed quite fast on gender, on ethnicity, on homosexuality and so on. So we can speed up change by showing it's possible and getting people to act close to home. Instead of people saying, I wish to be part of an empathetic agenda about the nature of society and structural issues. And of course they exist, but you should say, what is it in your power? As Sanjay was saying, what are the changes that you can make? So the FTSE 100 aren't on track yet, but at least they've got a track. There'll be no all white boards by 2021 is our expectation. The NHS trusts haven't set that track. Major society groups haven't set that track. So I think being very specific about the things that are in the power of the institution that we're talking to change at home in their institution is what absolutely has to go with these sort of expressions of global solidarity, because those don't actually take us anywhere.
Sanjay Bandari, the thing is that this specificity that we have got is also being played. We're being played. And let me explain what I mean by that. There are people who will approach high-ranking Black, Asian, minority ethnics, get them onto the interview panel, onto the shortlist, and not give them the job. But they can then turn around and say, hey, we have tried to be diverse. How do we guard against the box-ticking exercise and the inherent playing of covert racism?
I think the only way you can do that, I'd always say this, is around data. You just got to constantly push.
But the data is
for
there.
the public. Well,
the data will turn around and say that we've been shortlisted. 25% have been shortlisted.
Absolutely, and some of it will show that. But actually, my experience is, by and large, that data isn't there for most organisations and most institutions. You know, in many industries, you don't have that transparency of information. So actually, creating those data sources of actually what is the makeup of your board and actually every layer down, and what's the percentage of people that you're hiring, and what was the shortlist and where did you get the shortlists from, and actually what we've also started to see is, so we have to be really careful about, I think targets are better than the absence of targets, but when you do set targets, you have to be cognizant of how they're going to be gamed, which is kind of what you're describing. So, one of the phenomena, because I was part of the Parker Review on ethnicity on UK boards, and one of the things that we would see and hear anecdotally is the Asian female double box ticker, because you're going to get both the gender and the BAME card. And out of all of those people that can do that, would I want a Black female or an Asian female? Well, actually, this is all about the perceptions we have, because there's a hierarchy between white men, white women, men, gay women, Black men, Black women, Asian men, Asian women. We all have a slightly different pitch in that hierarchy and a slightly different set of perceptions. And actually, what we started to see was using Asian women because Asian people are perceived as more passive, and so actually they'll be less troublesome on the board, and we'll put them in a non-exec position. But of course, once we got that transparency, we can start talking about it. We've already seen some of that, so we can start talking about it. Even that is better than zero, but we have to keep making that progress. So keep going. I think for me, it's always about, we have to push for more and more reporting of the data, more and more sharing of the data, because the more information we've got, the greater ability we've got to call people out when they're gaming the system. The fact is, they're gaming the system already, but we've got no transparency over it.
Dawn Butler, do we need more figures, more statistics to create concrete change?
So there's a couple of things here. If you don't measure it, you can't change it. So it's really important to measure it. I agree it was a good thing. I think the race disparity audit and the work did there was really good. But then what happened? Nothing happened. Do you know what I mean? Windrush scandal happened. Do you mean? And they didn't do anything. Tackling the burning injustices, it was not tackled. They added fuel to the fire. And in fact, the race disparity audit stopped functioning. And it's only when the government found themselves in trouble again that all of a sudden they mentioned the race disparity unit again. But in addition to that, another report. We don't need another report. We have enough reports and we have enough data. Why don't we start fixing, what's been highlighted before? If at the end of the implementation of the 200 plus recommendations, there's still work to do, then fine, let's do the work. So data is always good, but God damn it, got enough data. But and also, where is the Office of Tackling Injustices? I mean, that was like a really good suggestion, but it doesn't exist. Where is it? Where's the money behind it? Where is the office? So all these ideas were there, got the government out of a sticky situation, and now they're not doing anything else. I'll tell you what's important about data is that, so as we come out of lockdown, for instance, what we need to do is follow the data and invest according to the data. Otherwise, the data is meaningless. So that means in the areas where have been highly affected by COVID-19 and the high rates of death, what we need to do is follow that data and invest accordingly. Because what happens is that doesn't happen. And so you'll still get discrepancies in, you know, which will manifold itself 100 times after lockdown because this government's going to go into a serious recession. So what I say is, we've got the data, so now we need to follow the data and invest accordingly to that data. Then it becomes meaningful. Then we will see structural, long-lasting change.
So, Willie, I need to give you a response to Dawn's, because you chair the disparity unit. Were you just there to be used by government and then to be ignored when the real tough implementation came in?
No, I've never wielded so much power. In the sad part is about it was a short space of time when Theresa May was, I guess, in her pomp, which wasn't very long. She could pick up the phone and I would speak to a Secretary of State and talk about radical change. We sat down and the plan was to make two policy and one announcement every 2 months. And right now on the Bays department, there is a policy that needs to be implemented. It's called the Ethnic Minority Pay Gap Reporting. It's there. We campaigned for it. We consulted upon it, but it's been kicked into the long grass. You know, central to change, and our Solanke brothers who are on this call, that they've dealt with all of the last 5 or 6 prime ministers. They all come to their events and eat their food and share stories, but they will know that change is predicated on political will.
And you're saying there's no political will?
There's little or no political will. That's
a huge thing for the chair of the race disparity unit to say, that the government does not have political will.
Well, I said there's little political will.
But it's true, but it's actually factual, because if there was political will, Simon would be still doing the work that he was doing, right, rather than the race disparity unit not functioning. So it's already there.
To be clear about the race disparity unit, that is fully functioning. But what's critical is that data is not enough. You need champions to turn the data into policy change. And so the disparity unit lays bare the uncomfortable truths. And my job under Theresa May was to take those uncomfortable truths and go to the minister, and I was charged with saying, what are you doing about this? And then say, I've got a few ideas of my own. And then we'd have the conversation. There's nobody doing that right now. And so the government are leaping from one crisis to another, first Windrush, then COVID, then George, and scrambling around precisely because they're not proactive in acknowledging the deficit, the disparities, and then having a plan to do it. Now, I know that you'll record some of this, and I hope you don't cherry pick the headlines for hyperbole. What I would suggest—
That's our job.
That's your job. That's your journalist job, Sanjay, Barney, Sash. I've got to try and rein you in. And I'll tell you why, because Dawn will know this, above all, there's a window of opportunity at this historic moment, and in so many areas. What's critical to this window of opportunity is leadership, and not just hyperbole. And so we all have a leadership role to play. Dawn in opposition, the Solanke brothers in the media, Sanjay in sports, and you two in your academic institutions, Barney. But we've got to plan. What is the framework for us to change our world in this historic time? Some will easily buy into it. Others, like the government, have to be either convinced or taken along with the momentum. But it's our job to do that. I hoped that they would readily get it, but that's not been my experience. But let's see.
Simon, one thing does worry me, and I'm sorry, I just want to labour this point. You said to me that the ethnic pay gap report is ready to go with its recommendations, and it's being kicked into the long grass. This smacks again of the PHE report, where people like Dawn Butler had to demand that the PHE report, the second part that Kevin Fenton produced, was coming out. This is not the right thing for government to do.
Look, we want the government to show intent that Black Lives Matters more than a slogan. And the lowest hanging fruit for this government is to say, given that a disproportionate amount of people that died in COVID-19 were either on low pay and or 0-hour contracts, our first step forward must be to force businesses over 200 to lay bare their ethnic minority pay gap reporting. And that way, that will galvanize, as it's done the gender pay gap reporting, companies to see who they're paying what and how they might change it. But it's not just that. The other big ask, Barney, I mean, you know, we have to focus this on solutions. And we've been asking for a COVID-19 race equality strategy. 130,000 people have signed our petition. And what it would do is it would follow the disease where it's laid bare those uncomfortable truths. And you would have a serious conversation, explain or change why Black and brown people are being disproportionately affected in these areas and what's the plan to close the gaps. It's a real opportunity. And it's an opportunity that us as leaders, our generation, must not lose.
Let's move on because we're coming to the end of our debate and I really want to get something from you guys, which is this. You have the ear of the Prime Minister, you have the ear of the new Commission. What are you going to tell them? What are you going to recommend that they do, Sundar?
Well, what we've got and what the Prime Minister can come back to and be proud of because the work was done, we've got the best data in the world on this in terms of knowing what's there and knowing what's not there. Now we've got to act on it. If you want to deal with the ethnic disparities in France or in Sweden, you just don't know what they are because you don't collect that data. That's something the British state has decided to do. And now it needs to show how you act on that for equal opportunity and for no unfair barriers. But most organisations waking up to this, they don't know what to do. They don't feel comfortable about it. They've all got diversity programs, they've never evaluated them. So they need some assistance in how to turn it into a solution. And therefore this solution-focused dialogue that is about equal opportunity, reduce the unfair barriers, and how do we make progress, how do we measure it, is something that everyone can get behind. And that's why I'm sceptical, actually, of a debate about white supremacy and white privilege, because we make a conversation that people feel is very uncomfortable. We make it incredibly uncomfortable and people don't know how to act. We need some discomfort to bring about action on changing, but we need people to feel that they are culturally equipped to start to go on that journey and to speed it up. So government showing how to act, helping other people act, making sure the FTSE 100 companies act, and then modelling that so that every university, every sports club, every major charity actually has a plan that the board discuss and know what's in it, not just a box that they've ticked that they pretended to do something.
Do you know what gets me, Sanjay? It's this. We know that there are Black players who want to go into management but are being put off because there aren't enough. There is no pipeline of talent. There is no taking from one step to another to a journey and mentoring and making sure that they are put into positions of real influence. What recommendations do you make to government and this race commission?
Well, I suppose I'd separate out football from the government and the race commission. I think for the government and the race commission, I would say the first thing you should do is look at all the other previous things that you've done, and within the first month, just have a plan for implementing all the previous recommendations that have been made. Don't start from ground zero again. We've already done this. We've already been down this road, and you're guaranteed to lose us, because if you're going to start from square one again, we're all going to think this is, you're just going to kick it into the long grass. The first month, just pull out the recommendations from all the previous reports. Even if you just focused on the common recommendations, you'd probably have 20 things that you have to do. I think with football, I've already kind of set out a manifesto of things that I would like to see. And I think a couple of days after I published my opinion piece in the Times, Paul Elliott did his open letter to English football on behalf of the FA. And I'm working with Paul. There's a sort of 3-month process that we're trying to produce a voluntary code for equality in football leadership. And I want to see the kinds of things, the recommendations that I've suggested. So by 2025, we set a target that by 2025, 20% of the boardroom is people of colour. By 2025, 25% of our coaches are people of colour. And those are deliberately set, those figures, because we got 30% of the players. So 25% is very achievable in 5 years. We also have to understand what are those systemic blockages. And that is, in football, the informal networks that create those big posts. So I'm not in favour of setting a target for the first team manager's job, because there are only 92 of those at any one point in time. And actually the big challenge is not the 92, it's the fact that when you get a manager in, they normally come with an entourage. And guess what your entourage is? It's my mates who I know, and the 6 or 7 people that I'm used to. And guess who's in my network? It's people who look like me and are like me, because that's what we all do. So we have to find ways to penetrate those networks, but also to disrupt the networks by creating job ads and job vacancies and recruitment systems. But if you can do that, throughout the system, you're going to have many more coaches that come through, and it become a much more natural part of the process that you're going to be starting to think about accessing different pools. My point about data was more about, we've actually got enough base data, certainly in football, we've got enough base data from the egregious statistical anomalies to justify action. There's a whole bunch of actions that we need to put into place, but what we don't have is the regular collection of that data by every club and the regular sharing of that data by every club. So I've been advocating, I've offered that we can run that, and we can do an annual report that says the state of the play, exactly where we are, all the way through the levels of English football. We don't have to reveal any individual club. We can anonymise it. You can do it by region, but we can say with each club or type of club, how are we doing? How are we doing from the academy coaches and the academy players all the way through to the first team and the coaches and to the boardroom? Just data about that. So that's the way we track our progress. We've got enough data to do the action. We've got loads of actions that we can take and that we can discuss. Now it's time to put those into place. And I suppose my last thing in football is the plea to the people with the real power. Sky have announced that they plan to invest 30 million in initiatives as a response to Black Lives Matter. Their biggest power would be forgiving some of the debts that they're owed by the clubs in return for inclusion targets being set and met. That would actually be the biggest impact that they could make on society and football.
Dawn Butler, Sanjay has given some really practical ideas. How do we take some of his ideas and your ideas? What would you be saying to Boris Johnson's race commission?
Okay, let me go through a quick list that I made earlier. So scrap the race commission. There's absolutely no need for it. Sack Dominic Cummings and all the others that believe in eugenics and all of that stuff. Apologise for previous insults that was made, because a lot of this has to do with reflection. And I take on board Sunday's point in terms of there needs to be some form of, I think that would be a good start. Denouncing the far right, who often refers to Boris Johnson as their leader. Set up the office of tackling injustice, because the foundation's already there for that. And I think that once an office is set up, it's very difficult then to move away from that, because it's an office rather than a commission or an idea or an initiative. It's a government office, and that is vital and important. Set up a conference with lots of small organisations who never normally communicate or get together And I think that's vital, because there, you know, we don't really have the white men's kind of club, you know, the secret handshake, and that kind of needs to be built. Merge all of the BAME groups in the civil service, because there are a number of them, and actually they need to be merged, because what often happens is voices are silenced, and actually you shouldn't be scared of amplifying the voices that you often silence, because that's when you can get real change and real insight into the decisions that you're making. No procurement without race audits and responsibilities. For too often, the government, you know, gives procurement contracts to lots of organisations, and there's no responsibility behind that. It needs to almost be like an inclusion rider, you know, where actors and stuff have inclusion riders. We need to kind of, you know, implement some of that in government, and I think that will see vital change. Make sure every single legislation has an equality impact assessment, and it is reviewed before, during and after, because otherwise you don't know what's happening. There could be an unintended consequence. You know, some of the stuff that the government does, maybe they don't really mean for it to affect Black and Asian people in a negative way. Maybe it's just something that happens as an unintended consequence. Well, review it, do some post-legislative work, review it, and then change it. And then follow the data with investment. And that way we'll see structural change.
Simon Woolley, Dawn Butler, that was an extensive list. Thank you very much indeed. Well, I don't think we need to go any further, but I will, because Simon Woolley, you're the chair of the Race Disparity Unit. There's a race commission going on.
I'm not in Dawn's shoes, where quite rightly she can be fiercely oppositional and say those things harshly. My role, a bit like Sunda, is to work in a different space that has to take people along with us. And I would say, look, if you're going to have a commission, then please let's not have it looking for data because the data's there, but rather look for a commission for solutions. And as Sanjay has highlighted, the number one solution would be to implement the recommendations from the 11 previous reviews that are now sitting on the shelf. The second, lowest hanging fruit, implement the ethnic minority pay gap reporting ASAP. The third conversation would be, if I was sitting with Boris Johnson, then I would say, coming out of a crisis, which might see the biggest economic downturn for a generation, and entering COVID-19, a Brexit world, that we need a strategy, I would argue, a race equality strategy that does two things. But one, that those that have already had a devastating impact with COVID-19 are not hit again by the economic downturn. But even more important is that when you are looking how you can remove those barriers that Dawn mentioned in the 100 meters, that actually it's self-serving, because you're unleashing talent. You're having pathways for people to fulfill their potential. And given we've got these shocking challenges, why would you be putting up these barriers for people to help a country when it most needs it? So my conversation would be looking at the self-interest argument for him to realize that by design or default, let's say by default, that a lot of the journey is holding people back when it should be unleashing them. The second thing would be to say, look, you've been in that ward fighting for your life, and the vast majority of people that were around you fighting for your life were Black and brown people. And at this critical moment, that you as our leader need to acknowledge the contribution that these people are making every single day, and with barely any acknowledgement. And that extends beyond the NHS, and begin to open up them pathways for them and their children to fulfill their great potential. And that's leadership.
Panel, we've run out of time. Many thanks to all of you. East and I will now put up our discussions online. We'll be writing about it, of course, and perhaps in terms of public policy, we'll be sending a précis of your recommendations to the government. Until our next roundtable, Many thanks to all my colleagues at Eastern Eye and to all the panelists who've taken part for a really enjoyable and, I think, very interesting, thought-provoking discussion. Thank you for joining us. Stay safe, as well as alert. Goodbye.